Hey y'all, Coach in the Fight here, looking in the book of Malachi. Yeah, it looks a little strange over here at Hermas Academy because we're still living without the internet, showing a little bit of a kink in our armor as we can't get to one of the handy dandy specialty Bible tools there that looks all pretty and stuff. We're having to use this old notepad text TXT file that I have with the King James Version on it. Yeah, I have been preparing for these days to come. Got, like I said, showing a little bit of kinks in the armor as I haven't prepared as well as I thought I had, but I got it anyway. And I'm looking over here in the 4th chapter of the book of Malachi. Now, mind you, this is the very last chapter in the Old Testament. And I say that again for a fact. This is the very last chapter in the whole book that we call the Old Testament. And we're looking at the last 2 verses. And the last verse says, "Behold, I will send you Elijah, the prophet, before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord. And he shall turn the hearts of the fathers to the children, and the heart of the children to their fathers, lest I come and smite the earth with a curse." Now, if I had the internet, this is one thing I would like to look up, is the Hebrew interlinear Bible, and see if this word fathers actually has an S on it. Because to me, I'm wondering if he didn't mean that he's going to turn the heart of the father to the children, which of course it already is, but more importantly, that he's going to turn the children or the hearts of the children to their Father, meaning our Father in heaven, the creator of all things, the one who created the heaven and the earth and all of us. I'm wondering if that's what Malachi meant here, and maybe it may have been misunderstood. And of course, one of the ways we could figure that out is go look at the interlinear Bible and look at the Hebrew and look what was actually read there. But, maybe you guys could do that and put it down in the comments, or maybe we'll get to do it another day when we get the internet back in the house. But one other thing in this verse here that I want to point out is this part about Elijah here, the prophet. Now, we know that he always precedes the Father when he comes to earth. You had Elijah back there 2,000 years ago in the form of John the Baptist, which led a lot of people to the Father before the Messiah came on the scene. That's what Elijah does. That's what this Elijah figure does. He kind of comes on the scene and he leads people back ahead of time. He's come back this time as well. He's here now. We do have the ability to commune with this Elijah type of individual, except now he's in a spirit form where he can come and dwell with us in a spiritual kind of nature. And we read all about that in the Third Testament, and you can see some classes that we give on the Third Testament talking about that kind of thing. And but what we want to talk about in particular in this class is verse 4, where it says, "Remember ye the law of Moses my servant, which I commanded unto him in Horeb for all Israel, with the statutes and the judgments." Now, one thing I want to note that when I'm looking at my hardcover Bible over here, it actually has this word "with" as an italicized word, meaning it's kind of an added word to help us make sense. And when you read it without the italicized word, it says, "Remember ye the law of Moses my servant, which I commanded unto him in Horeb for all Israel, the statutes and the judgments," kind of implying that the law that he's talking about is the statutes and the judgments. All right, and that's what we want to talk about. What exactly is Malachi referring to when he said the law of Moses, which I command? What law is he talking about? Now, I like to point out that there is an aversion to the Father's law in the church these days. Here in 2019, 2020, whenever you're listening to this class, or whenever you're listening to this video, you'll know that there's a lot of people who are involved in the church, or the Protestant churches or the Catholic churches, who have an aversion to the law, meaning they don't keep the law. They think they're not supposed to keep the law. In fact, it's actually frowned upon in most churches when you talk about how you're supposed to keep the law. But here we are in the last chapter of the Old Testament, and he's kind of bringing us back to the law. And without jumping to another verse, we remember that the Father said or the Messiah said that, he kept the law, and he advised that we all teach the law as well. So his kind of the scriptures kind of point us back to the law. Another verse that jumps out to me right now is the first book of the first chapter of Psalms. Psalms 1, refers back to the law as well. Not many people talk about that chapter of Psalms. They always talk about 23 and 91 and other ones that, make them feel good, but they kind of avoid the ones that talk about the law, which I would, say that is the majority of them, kind of refers us back to the law. But getting back on subject here in Malachi chapter 4, verse 4, what law is he talking about? He says the law of Moses, my servant. But we know that Moses got a lot of information from the Father. He was actually he was actually the only person that talked face to face with with the Father, the same way that you would talk to your friend, where there was a back and forth conversation going on with Moses and the Creator there. So Moses got a lot of information from the Father. But what is this law that he's talking about? All right, now look further in that verse. He says, which I commanded unto him in Horeb for all of Israel. So now that kind of narrows it down. That narrows it down a little bit, or it narrows it down a lot, because we remember the story of when they came out of Egypt, how they kind of was in a desert or in the wilderness of sin for a little while, walking around this mountain, which I think which was Horeb. This was the same place that Moses had discovered the burning bush there. This is the same place that he got the Ten Commandments. Now, is this the law that he's talking about with the statutes and the judgments? Well, let's come over here and let's do a search for the word Horeb and see what we find. Okay, now one thing that we find up here in Psalms 106 and 19 is talks about how they made a calf in Horeb and worship the molten image. Now you remember in the story is when Moses was actually on the mountain getting the Ten Commandments. Is that down there at the base of the mountain, Aaron and the rest of the children of Israel were actually making this calf that's talking about. So that's letting us know where Horeb is that mountain where Moses got the Ten Commandments. All right, here's that verse that we was referring to over here, where it talks about how when Moses was there with his father-in-law Jethro keeping his flock, that he actually found the burning bush there in Horeb, when he actually went up this mountain there in Horeb. And we find out in this verse 17 and 6. This is Exodus 17 and 6. Is when Moses was able to strike a rock and give the people some water. So so there's a lot going on around this mountain. Let's look at the next one. Up here in 33 and 6 of the same book of Exodus, he's talking about how they stripped themselves of their ornaments by the Mount of Horeb. Now, without going into a whole lot of detail what they're actually doing here, I'd have to look and see what exactly they're doing here when they're actually stripping the ornaments off. But we're going to try to finish this video up. We'll come back to that at another time. This verse here coming out of Deuteronomy down here in verse 10, it says specifically the day that thou stoodest before the Lord thy God in Horeb, when the Lord said unto me, gather me the people together, and I will make them hear my words. This is kind of what we're talking about over there in Malachi. He's talking about the day that he gave them, like up here it says statutes and judgments. Let's read this whole little paragraph here, starting in verse 7. He says, for what nation is there so great, who has God so nigh unto them, as the Lord our God is in all things that we call upon him for? And what nation is there so great, that has statutes and judgments so righteous as all this law, which I set before you this day? So now, like we were saying over there in Malachi, when we kind of ignored the word with, that word that was added in there, it's kind of saying the law is the statutes and the judgments. See how it's saying here? That has statutes and judgments, so righteous as all this law. So to me, the way I understand this is that the law is the statutes and the judgments. He's gone. He says, only take heed to thyself and keep thy soul diligently, lest thou forget all the things which thine eyes have seen, and lest they depart from thy heart all the days of thy life, but teach them to thy sons and thy sons' sons. Talking about what they received there at the bottom of Mount Horeb on that day when Moses got the commandments there, where Moses delivered the commandments and to the people. And again, verse 10 says specifically the day that thou stoodest before the Lord thy God in Horeb, when the Lord said unto me, gather me the people together, and I will make them hear my words, that they may learn to fear me all the days that they shall live upon the earth, and that they may teach their children. Okay. So we see how important this is, what information they got there at Mount Horeb, how, they basically were given a huge show there. It had a lot of lightning, a bunch of trumpets were blowing. There was, the ground was trembling. There was all kinds of stuff going on there to make an impression on these 2 million plus people that were standing at the bottom of the mountain with Moses there, receiving this information from the Father. He never intended for them to forget that. He intended for them to teach their children, for all times there. Another verse up here in Deuteronomy, verse 15 of chapter 4, it says, Take ye therefore good heed unto yourselves, for ye saw no manner of similitude on the day which the Lord spake unto you in Horeb out of the midst of the fire, lest ye corrupt yourselves and make your graven image a similitude of any figure, the likeness of a male or a female. He's giving them basically the second commandment here, telling them, okay, when you was at Horeb and you saw all of this stuff, you actually didn't see nothing you could make a picture of. You had lightning, you had storms, you had trumpets, you had voices, you had a bunch of this, but what you didn't have was a form that you can then go and make an image of for you to worship. That was lacking. And so what he was telling them is, don't go making an image, in the future, which we did. We made an image of the Messiah. And, some people has gone as far as to draw out a picture of the Father himself. But, like it's saying here in 15, is you didn't have that to go by. But there's now looking over here in verse 5 and 2 is kind of when we're getting down to what we're actually looking for here. Verse 5, chapter 5, verse 2 says, the Lord our God made a covenant with us in Horeb. Now like I said, this is what I was looking for here, because this is what Malachi is referring to when he's talking about the law, the statutes and the judgments. That's what they actually got there. Like I said, there was trumpets, there was lightning, there was, all kinds of stuff going on. But what they were getting, what the Father was telling them, was the covenant. And so that's what Malachi is pointing back to. He's telling the people to adhere to the covenant, to remember the covenant. Now let's finish out these, and we're going to jump back over there to Malachi. Verse 3 says, the Lord made not this covenant with our fathers, but with us, even us, who are all of us here alive this day. Now this verse is a little bit tricky right here, because it's referring to reincarnation. Now not a lot of people understand reincarnation, especially since our Bibles was changed and the word reincarnation was taken out of the scripture and replaced with resurrection. And in light of that, this verse don't make a whole lot of sense. But when we start to think about, how the churches have always taught reincarnation up until, up until the Justinian period, which with the Catholic Church, then it will kind of make sense. What he's saying here, real simple and plain is, those people that were standing there at the bottom of Horeb receiving these commandments are us. We are the reincarnated spirits of those individuals that was there that day, and we are once again being reminded to go back and start obeying the covenant and listening to the covenant. But we're kind of getting out of scope here a little bit. All right, let's go back to Malachi. All right, you see right here, verse 4 says, "Remember ye the law of Moses my servant, which I commanded unto him in Horeb for all of Israel, with the statutes and the judgments." So I think it should be clear here that the last chapter of the last book of the Old Testament is pointing us back to the covenant that they got at Horeb. And you say, what exactly is this covenant? Where does it go? This covenant starts in, it actually starts with the 10 Commandments there in Exodus chapter 20. Let's jump up to that. Now, one of the reasons why, I want to do this class, like I said, there's an aversion to the law. There's a lot of people who are trying to tell us that we aren't supposed to keep the law, especially our preachers and, the members of the Protestant church and the Catholic church. They're trying to tell us to get away from the law and that we're not supposed to keep it. They say stuff like Jesus did away with that and, and all of that, but that's just not true. We're being told to go back and remember that covenant being made. And what I want to do is go over there and actually draw our attention back to this covenant. We have some feast days covenant coming up, and one of the things that we're told to do is to worship on that day. And what better way to worship than to read the Father's word? And the book of the covenant could be one of the things that we could actually read through and see what it is that this law that he's talking about. See if this is something that is supposed to be alien to us. See that if this is actually something that we should be rejecting. I would argue that it is not. But let me come over here and show you what it looks like. All right, so we're up here in Exodus chapter 20, and verse 1 is where this is the occurrence that had happened there at the Mount Horeb. This is what the children got there at Mount Horeb. This is what went on that day. And you can see it starts off with the 10 Commandments. The first commandment, of course, is to have only one God. And you have the second commandment, which is to make no images. And it goes on down through the 10 Commandments. A lot of us remember those. That's the first part of the book of the covenant. Now, for the ministers, the Reverend Pastor Deacon Dr. Doug, as I like to refer to him, tells us that we are supposed to be rejecting the law, tells us that we're not supposed to be keeping the law, tells us that we are in an error for honoring the law. He's telling us that we are in error for adhering to these commandments. So what are we supposed to do in order to reject the law? Are we just supposed to start killing people and committing adultery and stealing and and lying to our neighbor and such? Well, if we refrain from doing those things, if we find it a problem, that to do those things, then we're actually keeping the law. And according to a lot of preachers, we're in error for doing that. All right, now I want you to see something right here. All right, after Moses has given them the 10 Commandments, it's like Moses, or it's like the Father. I shouldn't say Moses, because this is actually the Father who is talking up here. The Father has given them the 10 Commandments here. But then when you get down in his part, is in verse 18, he says, "And the people saw the thunderings and the lightnings and the noise of the trumpet and the mountain smoking. And when the people saw it, they removed and stood afar off. And they said unto Moses, Speak with us, and we will hear, and let not God speak with us, lest we die." This is an important part to bring out, because After the father had given them the 10 commandments, the people got scared, and they basically couldn't hear anymore. They couldn't listen to this. They realized that they were such weak individuals that they couldn't really stand under the voice of the father, and so they asked that Moses be their interpreter, or that Moses be their prophet, or that Moses would be the one who would go before the father and get this information and then bring it back to them. But notice that the story does go on. He continues to tell them the book of the covenant. Now, the book of the covenant, it goes all the way up to chapter 24. It goes all the way up to chapter 24, verse 7, is when this covenant ends. And you can see right there in verse 22, you start to hear the demands for exclusive worship, how the Father demands, us to worship him and him alone. And then you start getting, and then right here you have the judgments. See right there, these are the judgments that was talking about, right? And it starts telling you basically how when you see certain things in life, how to react to them. Like, for instance, if you have a servant, how are you supposed to treat that servant? And just going down through these and looking at some of these, again, I ask, are we really supposed to, reject this stuff here? There's like this verse right here, just picking them at random. 21:9 says, if he have betrothed her unto his son, he shall deal with her after the manner of a daughter, which means, you have this girl in your house that, plans to marry your son. You're actually supposed to treat her like a daughter. You're not supposed to treat her like, a stranger or something like that. You're actually supposed to clothe her. You're supposed to feed her. You're supposed to take care of her. Probably up until the time when they actually get married or whatever, and then the son is the responsibility to do that. And a lot of things, looking right here in 21 and 17, and he that curseth his father or his mother shall surely be put to death. This refers or points us back over to the commandment that says to honor our father and our mother. And a lot of these verses that we find in these judgments and the rest of the covenant, or the rest of the law, I should say, actually supports the 10 commandments. It's like a breakdown of what the 10 commandments, are talking about. When it says to honor your mother and your father, what exactly does it mean? Well, one of the things that it means is you don't curse your father or your mother. And it goes on to tell you why. If you actually go to curse your father or your mother, then you shall surely die. And so, like I said, the reason why I'm doing this class is hopefully to take away some of the aversion of the law, to make you rethink and say, should we be avoiding the law? Should we be rejecting the law? Is it so bad to keep the law like the preachers and the teachers tell us, So, when we're having these worship days, maybe we can go down and read these, or we can find us an audio book and listen to these and actually see, if this is something that we should be rejecting, or is this actually what the Father means when he says that we should remember these? Are we actually supposed to come in and actually do this stuff? Look at this right here. 22 and 28 says, thou shalt not revile the gods or curse the rulers of thy people. This is talking about how you may not or you may feel a certain way about the rulers of our countries, or you may understand how we have all of these phony gods around. Well, you don't just walk around bashing these phony gods. Some people are celebrating these holidays where they are worshiping these gods. Well, you don't spend your time reviling these gods or putting them down and such, because what will end up happening is they're going to turn around and revile your God. I've thought about this a lot. Why would you not do that? It's because if you start talking bad about their phony God, they're going to start talking bad about your God, and your God turns out to be the Father, the Creator, the real one. And so it's going to almost cause these people to commit blasphemy, and you don't want to do that. You don't want to have them cursing your God, so you don't go and curse their God. What does it say? Do unto others as you would have them to do unto you. If you curse their ruler, they're going to curse your ruler, and they're going to get in trouble for it, and you might get in trouble too. Especially when we have a judgment here that you aren't supposed to do that. It talks about how you're supposed to take care of the poor and not treat the poor badly, how you're not supposed to oppress the stranger and such, and why you're not to, because you was a stranger at one time when you was over there in Egypt. All right, now down here we start talking about statutes right here. Okay, now it doesn't mention the word statutes directly, but we find out, we know that the statutes that he's talking about include the feast days. And here he is about to talk about the feast days here. In 23 and 14 he says, 3 times thou shalt keep a feast unto me in a year. Thou shalt keep the feast of unleavened bread. Thou shalt eat unleavened bread for 7 days, as I commanded thee in the time appointed in the month Abib. For in it thou camest out of Egypt, and none shall appear before me empty. And the feast of harvest, the first fruits of thy labor, which thou hast sown in the field, and the feast of ingathering, which is in the end of the year, when thou hast gathered in the labors of thy field. These are included in the statutes, if not the statutes themselves. Now we know that there are 7 feasts total. It's just that these 3 are mandatory, talking about the feast of unleavened bread, which is different than Passover. It starts right after Passover. And then you have the harvest feast that starts 50 days later, the one they call Pentecost, or the Feast of Weeks. And then the Feast of Ingathering, that's the Feast of Tabernacles, which is a week-long feast like the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Those 3 feasts are mandatory feasts that is actually included in the covenant. The other ones are not included in the covenant. I would advise you to keep them all, but these right here are absolutely mandatory. All right. And so again, this is the law that he's talking about. Those are your statutes, and these are the judgments. This is the law that he's talking about there at the end of Malachi. And this is also the law that the Messiah was talking about too, when he was telling people that they ought to keep the law, and he who doesn't keep the law will be considered least in the kingdom of heaven, and he who teaches the law and teaches men that should keep the law will be counted great in the kingdom of heaven. This is the law that he's talking about, not all of the book of Exodus, or all of the 613 different rules that are given in the first 5 books. He's talking about what was given there in Mount Horeb. Now you look right here where it's getting ready to end right here. This is when the covenant has actually ended there in the last verse of chapter 23. And this is actually where it, verse 7 is when it's actually all over of 24. It says, and he took the book of the covenant. That's what we've been talking about these last few verses. He took the book of the covenant and read in the audience of the people, and they said, all that the Lord has said will we do, and be obedient. Again, he was talking to us, us in our past lives, and he's talking to the world too. Everybody is supposed to be keeping this covenant, if you want to walk in the good graces of the Father, if you want to be on his good side, if you want him to be taking care of you, taking care of your family, providing for your needs, then this is the book of the covenant that we actually are supposed to be adhering to. And like I said, I advise you to take some time to go ahead and read through all of these so that you can have an idea. But before I close this out, I want to give you another reason why this is so important here, if I can find it. All right, coming up here in chapter 23, verse 20. Like I said, this is extremely important, and that I'm gonna tell you before we close this out. Don't click off yet. Like I said, this is really, really important. You read right here in verse 20, it says, behold, I send an angel before thee to keep thee in the way, and to bring thee into the place which I have prepared. Talking about an angel right here. Verse 21 says, beware of him, and obey his voice. Provoke him not, for he will not pardon your transgressions, for my name is in him. Verse 22 says, but if thou shalt indeed obey his voice, and do all that I speak, then I will be an enemy unto thine enemies, and an adversary unto thy adversaries. All right, so this is saying, this is an if statement. I believe the biggest word in the Bible is if. If you do this, then this will happen. Because if you don't, it ain't gonna happen. So if you obey his voice, talking about this angel that he has promised to give with you, it's kind of like a guardian angel figure. They call him the covenant angel. If you will obey the voice of the covenant angel, this is the angel of this book of the covenant right here. And you find out later on that he's Aaron. Or somebody like that. And it says, and if you do this and do all that I speak, meaning this covenant, then I will be an enemy unto thine enemies and an adversary unto our adversaries, meaning he will start to help you out. He'll start to take care of you. And being here so close to the tribulation, this is extremely important because we're going to have this covenant angel to be a helper to help us get us through this tribulation. And in order to do that, like he said up here, if we want him to be this protector for us, we have to obey the covenant. Basically, what it boils down to is we have to obey the covenant. When it says, for my angel shall go before thee. All right, if we do this. Now, I'm not going to get into the Hittites and the Perizzites and the Canaanites and who all of these other Zites are, because we said we're going to go ahead and close this out. So I'm going to go ahead and get this closed out, guys. If you have any comments, put them down below. If you got something out of this, go ahead and hit that like button. We try to put out classes, as often as we can. Things are getting a little bit slow as far as putting out classes here, getting a little bit tougher for us, but we're still putting them out as fast as we can here. So go ahead and hit that subscribe button or hit that like button if you haven't done so already, and pray for us.